They said the widow bought him because he was beautiful, the most striking man ever to stand on that auction block. But beauty, as she would learn, has a way of exposing what rot lies beneath. She thought she had purchased strength, obedience, and silence, yet what she truly brought into her home was a mirror, one that refused to flatter her lies. It was not the man who was cursed, but the truth he carried, and by the time she understood that, it was already too late to unsee what she had seen. The story begins not with the widow's wealth or the auctioneer's call, but with the quiet tremor that moves through her when she first lays eyes on the man no one dares to bid for. His beauty is almost unnatural, the kind that unsettles rather than comforts. His presence is magnetic and unnerving, a paradox wrapped in silence. To the widow, still cloaked in her mourning black and the illusion of dignity, his beauty seems like salvation, a distraction from the hollow ache of her loneliness. Yet beneath that surface attraction lies something older and darker, the human fascination with what is forbidden, with the reflection of our own buried selves. Beauty in this story is not merely aesthetic, it is a portal into the unconscious, a mirror that reveals more than the eyes wish to see. The widow has spent years in control of her estate, her servants, her image, even her grief. She has mastered the art of restraint, the same way the world around her has mastered cruelty behind civility. Her plantation thrives on silence, on rules never spoken aloud but always obeyed. When she sees him, standing in chains but unbowed, her composure fractures. For the first time, she is drawn not to what is respectable, but to what is real. She feels something raw, almost dangerous. Desire, yes, but also fear. It is not the fear of what he might do, but of what she might feel in his presence. His beauty does not soothe her, it exposes her. It whispers of the parts of herself she has buried beneath religion, propriety, and grief. The onlookers at the auction sense something she does not. Their hesitation is not moral, it is instinctive. They know that beauty, this pure, this unsettling, carries a cost. In him, they see something that cannot be possessed without consequence. The widow, however, interprets their silence as opportunity. She mistakes their fear for foolishness, thinking herself braver, wiser, more discerning. She does not yet understand that the fear in the crowd is not of the man, but of the truth he represents. The kind of truth that does not bow to chains or gold. The truth that beauty, when it stands in defiance of corruption, becomes a threat to everything false. When she bids for him, it is as though she is bidding for the parts of herself long denied. Her purchase is not of flesh, but of a symbol, an unconscious attempt to reclaim vitality, passion, life itself. Yet the paradox of possession begins to unfold immediately. The more she gazes at him, the more she realizes that he is not truly there for her to own. His beauty does not belong to her. It reflects her. It mirrors every contradiction within her soul, her desire for freedom and her participation in oppression, her hunger for meaning and her fear of change. He becomes the embodiment of her shadow, that unseen self that holds all the impulses, emotions, and truths she has suppressed. The widow's world has long worshipped appearances. Her late husband's plantation thrives because it maintains the illusion of order, decorum, and divine approval. Yet here stands a man whose beauty mocks that illusion. His very existence whispers that no system built on cruelty can hide forever behind grace. His face is a question, one that cannot be answered by prayer, etiquette, or wealth. It asks what she has become. And though she cannot yet articulate it, something in her begins to tremble at the thought that beauty might not be good, that grace might conceal horror, that the loveliest things can also be the most dangerous when they awaken the conscience. In his eyes, she sees not submission, but knowing, a kind of ancient sadness that defies the world's hierarchies. The more she looks at him, the more she feels herself being seen. And in that gaze, all her carefully maintained order begins to crack. Her servants whisper that the man carries a curse, that no one who has looked upon him too long has remained the same. She dismisses it, calling it superstition. Yet deep inside, she knows the curse is real, only not in the way they think. The curse is awareness. The curse is beauty that reveals truth. The curse is the confrontation between what we pretend to be and what we are. Night after night, she dreams of him, not as her property, but as her reflection. His face merges with hers in the mirror until she cannot tell where the boundary lies. She begins to see her own cruelty in his chains, her own emptiness in his silence. What first appeared as fascination begins to feel like haunting. She realizes that she did not buy him out of kindness or desire alone, but out of the need to master her own discomfort, to prove that she could still control what frightened her. Yet the human soul cannot own what it does not understand. The more she tries to define him, the more his beauty slips beyond definition, becoming something spiritual, symbolic, almost divine. This is the essence of the shadow behind beauty, that what draws us most powerfully often contains what we fear most deeply. The widow's attraction is not simply romantic, it is existential. It is the psyche's yearning for wholeness, the pull toward the parts of ourselves we deny. His beauty is the light that illuminates her darkness, but light, when it shines upon unhealed wounds, feels like pain. In that pain, she begins her descent, a descent not into evil, but into truth. For beauty, in its purest form, demands confrontation. It demands that we see, even when seeing breaks the heart. When the widow brought the man back to her estate, she did not see a person. She saw property, as her world had taught her to. Ownership was the foundation of her existence. Ownership of land, of servants, of reputation, even of grief. She had learned to contain life within boundaries, to name and possess whatever threatened to escape her grasp. Yet what she did not realize was that her entire sense of self depended on that illusion of control. The act of buying the handsome slave was, to her, an affirmation that she still ruled something in a world that had taken her husband, her youth, and her sense of meaning. She believed she had acquired strength, but in truth, she had purchased the very force that would dismantle her illusions. The moment he stepped into her home, the architecture of her certainty began to tremble. At first, she treated him as she would any possession of great value, with fascination masked by authority. She watched him as one might watch a caged flame, drawn to its warmth, yet wary of being burned. His silence unsettled her more than rebellion could have. He obeyed, but not out of fear. He moved through her halls like one who belonged to no one, like a spirit unwilling to be named. The servants whispered that he carried an energy that disturbed the air, that the birds grew quiet when he passed. She silenced them, pretending indifference, but deep within, she began to feel the same invisible shift, the faint erosion of her dominion. Every command she gave him felt hollow, as though she was speaking not to a man, but to her own conscience disguised in flesh. His eyes never challenged her, yet they never surrendered either. They held a kind of stillness that made her question the meaning of authority itself. What is power, she wondered, if it cannot reach the soul? Her late husband had ruled through fear. She tried to rule through gentility, but neither method could touch the essence of the man she now called hers. He was like water, impossible to hold, impossible to break, shaping itself around every attempt to contain it. The plantation, once a symbol of order, began to feel like a living mind, unraveling. Rooms she had not entered in years called to her. Memories long buried began to rise. She started to notice how the walls, once gleaming with portraits and polished wood, now seemed to watch her. Every creak, every flicker of candlelight carried an echo of judgment. It was as if the house itself no longer recognized its mistress. What she had thought was dominion was nothing more than a fragile illusion constructed to hide decay. The arrival of the slave did not create the cracks, it revealed them. The illusion of control extended beyond the physical. The widow tried to master her thoughts, to restrain her growing unease with prayers, routines, and social rituals. Yet the more she resisted, the more her thoughts revolved around him, not in the way of lust, though that lingered at the edges, but in the way one obsesses over an unsolved riddle. His presence defied logic. He was a paradox, enslaved yet free, silent yet powerful, present yet untouchable. Every time she looked at him, she sensed an unspoken message that control is not strength but fear disguised as authority. She began to lose sleep. At night, she would rise from her bed and wander through the halls, half expecting to find him waiting in the moonlight. Sometimes she thought she heard footsteps behind her, though no one was there. The house, the plantation, and her own mind merged into one vast theater of control, slipping away. She had always believed that ownership could preserve meaning, but now she saw that it only postponed reckoning. Each act of possession, every field, every slave, every coin, had been an attempt to fill the void that opened when love and faith departed her life. But what she owned never loved her back, and what she controlled never obeyed her soul. The man she had purchased embodied that truth. He was not hers because he never resisted being himself. His silence was his rebellion, his stillness his freedom. She, who had been the master of so many, now found herself mastered by what she could not define. The more she tried to assert dominance, the more she revealed her dependence on illusion. Control, she realized, was not power, but defense, the mind's desperate attempt to ward off chaos. But chaos, once awakened, does not retreat. One afternoon, she watched him in the field, his back glistening with sweat under the sun, his movements rhythmic, unhurried. Something inside her broke. It was not desire that consumed her then, but understanding that her control was the chain she had placed upon herself. The man before her was enslaved in body, yet freer than she had ever been. She, the widow of power, was the true captive, bound by her fear of losing order, her fear of the unknown, her fear of herself. From that moment, she could no longer bear the symbols of her supposed authority. The ledger of her account seemed meaningless, the plantation's wealth a burden. The house felt suffocating. She had bought him believing that ownership would restore her sense of identity, but instead, it dissolved it. Every attempt to define him unraveled her definitions of self. The more she saw him as human, the less she could live within the world that required him to be property. The illusion of control crumbled quietly, not with rebellion or fire, but with recognition. She understood, finally, that what we try to own most fiercely is often what owns us, and that the need to possess is only the soul's confession of emptiness. The plantation house stood on the edge of a vast field, its white columns tall and proud against the southern sun, but its beauty was deceiving. Time had not touched its walls so much as it had hollowed them out. Every corner breathed a quiet discontent, the kind that settles in spaces where too many secrets have been kept. When the widow brought the handsome slave home, the house did not welcome him. The air grew heavier, the silence deeper, as though the place itself remembered something she had long forgotten. The house, in its decaying grandeur, was no longer just a dwelling. It became a reflection of her inner world, her mind, her conscience, her hidden fears. What stood tall in daylight was crumbling in spirit, and every locked room whispered of things she had buried within herself. She had lived there since her marriage, through years of obedience and loneliness, through the quiet death of love and the noiseless rise of power. The house had been her refuge and her prison. Its corridors echoed with the footsteps of servants who never spoke her name, and the ghosts of a husband who had ruled her with gentility and distance. To the outside world, the plantation was a monument of prosperity. To her, it was a labyrinth where memory and guilt coexisted in uneasy silence. Every mirror reflected not her beauty, but her restraint, a woman sculpted by grief, order, and denial. Yet when the man entered her life, something shifted in that stillness. The symmetry of her world began to distort. The first change was subtle. She noticed it one evening as she walked down the main hall. The chandeliers flickered even when there was no wind, the air colder near the stairway where her husband had once stood to announce his will. The paintings on the walls seemed darker than before, their faces less kind, their eyes more accusing. She dismissed it as imagination, yet part of her knew the truth. The house was beginning to reveal what she had long refused to see. The physical decay mirrored her inner disintegration. The plaster peeling from the ceilings was like the shedding of her illusions. The creak of the floorboards beneath her feet was the voice of her conscience rising from beneath the weight of years. The gardens outside, once the pride of her late husband, had grown wild. Ivy crawled up the walls like memories she could no longer control. The roses bloomed in the wrong season, their petals dark as blood. She sometimes found herself wandering through them without remembering how she got there, her hand brushing against the thorns until she bled. The sensation of pain comforted her, reminding her that she was still alive. It was as if the estate itself, neglected and alive, was urging her to wake up, to face what had been festering beneath the surface of her composure. The man's presence made this transformation unavoidable. His silence did not disturb her peace. It revealed that she had never known peace at all. The rooms of the house became symbols of her inner divisions. The drawing room, always kept perfect for visitors who never came, represented her outer image, polished, controlled, and empty. The study, where her husband's books still lined the shelves, was the realm of her inherited beliefs, moral codes and justifications that had long served as her armor. But there were rooms she had locked and never entered, rooms filled with dust and covered furniture, where spiders wove their webs in the dark. Those were the chambers of her soul, the spaces where memories of cruelty and regret had been stored away. Sometimes she heard noises there, soft and persistent, like whispers trying to escape. One night, unable to resist, she opened one of those doors and found nothing but her own reflection in the cracked mirror across the room. It was then she realized that the haunting did not come from ghosts, but from the parts of herself she had banished. The handsome slave moved through the house quietly, as though he understood its language. He walked in places others avoided, stood by windows that had been closed for years, and sometimes lingered in the old chapel where the family used to pray. His presence seemed to awaken the dormant energy of the place. The walls groaned more deeply when he passed. The candles burned longer. The silence grew heavier. To the servants, this was proof of a curse. To her, it was something else, revelation. She began to understand that the house was not reacting to him, but to her, to what his arrival had stirred within her mind. In the evenings, she would find herself standing in the great hall, watching the reflection of the candlelight in the polished floor. The house seemed to breathe around her, its sighs mingling with her own. Every sound became symbolic. The ticking of the grandfather clock like the pulse of her guilt, the closing of distant doors like the shutting of memories she wasn't ready to face. The estate had become a living mind, and she was trapped inside it, unable to escape its unfolding. Sometimes she wondered if the man knew what the house represented. When their eyes met, she felt that he did. His calmness within those oppressive walls contrasted her unease. It was as though he belonged to the truth the house held, while she belonged to the lie it had built. The plantation was no longer merely her home. It was a confession, every board and brick echoing the psychological torment of its mistress. The decaying house and the haunted woman had become one. Each step she took inside its walls brought her closer to a reckoning she could neither delay nor deny. And though she tried to restore order, to polish the banisters and repair the cracks, the more she did, the more the house resisted, as if reminding her that the mind cannot be cleaned without first being seen. His silence became the most powerful sound in the house. It was not the silence of fear or submission, but the silence of someone who knows far more than words can hold. When the widow first noticed it, she mistook it for obedience. She believed his quietness was a mark of respect, perhaps gratitude, or at the very least, discipline. But the longer he remained without speech, the more she began to sense that it was not weakness that kept him still. It was understanding. His silence carried the weight of history, of suffering endured, of truths unspoken, because the world would rather not hear them. It was a silence that made others uneasy, because in its depth it mirrored everything they refused to face. Each morning, as he moved through the plantation, his calm presence unsettled the routine. The other slaves would work quickly in his shadow, their conversations hushed, their glances cautious. The overseer avoided looking him in the eye. Even the widow's most trusted servants grew restless when he entered a room. They whispered that he carried a curse, that his tongue had been silenced by dark spirits, that his gaze could pierce through the soul. Yet she, despite her growing unease, was drawn to that very stillness. The more the world around her reacted to his silence with fear, the more she wanted to understand it. His quietness was not emptiness, it was depth. It was the quiet of a mind that had seen the truth about the world and no longer needed to argue with it. At night, when she could not sleep, she would imagine the sound of his voice. She wondered what it would be like if he spoke, what language he would choose, what tone would carry from his lips. But the thought frightened her as much as it fascinated her. For in her dreams, when he did speak, it was not in words, but in revelations. His silence forced her to listen, not with her ears, but with her soul. She began to sense meanings in his movements, messages in the way he lifted his head or turned away. His silence spoke of the cruelty of her world, the fragility of her authority, and the weight of her guilt. It was a mirror, reflecting the hypocrisy of her surroundings. The plantation existed on constant noise, commands, cries, the cracking of whips, the songs sung in sorrow. Yet within that orchestra of sound, truth had always been silent. When the handsome slave refused to speak, he became that truth embodied. He was the unspoken conscience of the house, the human echo of everything the widow had ignored. His quietness was a judgment and a mercy. It judged her world by withholding acknowledgement of it, and it offered her a chance to hear herself without the distractions of false order. One evening, she called him into the parlor where she sat beside the fire. She had no purpose for summoning him, only an ache of curiosity. He stood before her, tall and composed, the firelight tracing the sharp lines of his face. She asked him questions, simple, polite questions about his past, his name, his family. He answered with a steady gaze but no sound. The silence stretched between them like a living presence, thick and undeniable. She felt small under it, exposed, almost ashamed of her words. When she dismissed him, her voice trembled. For the first time, she realized how shallow speech could be. Her questions were not for him. They were for herself, for the self she no longer understood. His silence had turned her own language into an echo. Days passed, and she began to hear him everywhere, even when he wasn't there. His silence was like a pulse that lived in the walls of the house. It reminded her of the truths buried beneath generations of wealth and cruelty, the screams that had built her comfort, the prayers that had gone unanswered, the humanity that had been denied. The more she listened, the more she recognized that his silence was not absence, but resistance. It was dignity in its purest form, By refusing to speak, he refused to become part of the false order that had enslaved him. He gave no answer because the question itself, her ownership, her authority, was unworthy of one. The widow began to change without realizing it. She spoke less, listened more, and for the first time began to feel the presence of her own conscience. The man's quietness had awakened something within her that had long been dormant, the inner voice that had been silenced by years of justification. Now it spoke softly but insistently, echoing through her thoughts like a ghost that would not rest. It asked her questions she could not answer. What is freedom? What is guilt? Who truly owns another's soul? His silence had become her teacher, her torment, and her salvation. The rest of the world continued to misunderstand it. They said he was dangerous, that something in him defied reason. But she knew better. He was not dangerous because of what he might do, but because of what he revealed. His silence dismantled the pretense that had built their world. It stripped away every illusion of superiority, every claim to moral authority. He spoke through stillness, and his quiet became the language of truth itself. In that silence, the widow began to awaken to the deepest reality of all, that what is unspoken often holds more power than any word, and that sometimes silence is not the absence of voice, but the voice of the soul when words can no longer bear the weight of truth. The revelation did not come with thunder or spectacle. It crept into the widow's awareness slowly, like dawn bleeding through the edges of a closed curtain. The truth she had been circling for weeks began to take shape not through logic, but through intuition, through an unease that refused to leave her. Every time she looked at the man she had bought, every time she felt that strange mix of fear and fascination, something whispered inside her, something ancient and buried, something that was not entirely her own voice. The mystery of why no one had dared to bid for him began to unravel not through words spoken by others, but through her own confrontation with what he represented. She had believed herself brave when she raised her hand that day at the auction, but bravery without understanding is blindness. And now the veil was lifting. Rumors had circulated in town long before the auction, though she had ignored them as superstition. They said he came from a line of men who had never bowed to a master, who carried within them the memories of generations, who could see through a person's heart as if it were made of glass. Some claimed he had once looked into the eyes of a man who beat him, and that the man went mad by morning. Others said his family had practiced forbidden knowledge, the kind that defied the laws of both faith and empire. The widow dismissed it all as the hysteria of fearful minds. But as days passed in her home, she began to understand that the truth behind these whispers was not in the details of the curse, but in what it revealed about those who feared him. They did not dread his power. They dreaded their reflection in it. No one had dared to bid against her because the man embodied what everyone at that auction wanted to forget. He was the living proof that the system they served was built on desecration, that their comfort, their civility, their wealth all rested upon the suffering of those who refused to be broken. His silence, his gaze, his very presence were reminders of the collective guilt that haunted them all. To purchase him would mean inviting that truth into their homes, and most could not bear such intimacy with conscience. But the widow, in her loneliness and her pride, had mistaken courage for isolation. She thought herself stronger than the others, unaware that she was walking willingly into the heart of her own undoing. The revelation struck not in a moment, but through small encounters that began to weave themselves into meaning. She noticed that animals behaved strangely in his presence. Dogs would grow restless, horses refused to meet his gaze, and the birds that once filled the garden with song fell silent when he walked beneath the trees. The house itself seemed to echo differently when he passed through its halls. But it was not until she found him standing in the old chapel one evening, his hands resting on the altar, that she truly understood the nature of what she had brought into her life. The air was still, heavy with a silence that felt sacred and terrible at once. When he turned to her, there was no defiance in his face, only sorrow, the kind of sorrow that belongs to someone who has seen too much truth to ever live comfortably again. In that moment, she realized what the others had feared. It was not curses or spirits that had kept them from bidding, but awareness, the unbearable recognition of shared humanity. They feared him because he could not be reduced to property. His beauty, his calm, his silence, all declared his freedom even in bondage. He carried within him something unbreakable, something that no chain could hold. And to look upon that unbrokenness was to see the lie of their entire world exposed. They did not fear that he was cursed, they feared that he was pure. They did not avoid him because he was dangerous, they avoided him because he was true. For the widow, this realization was devastating. Her entire identity had been built on the assumptions of difference, master and slave, ruler and ruled, civilized and savage. Now those boundaries dissolved. She could no longer look at him and not see herself. His suffering mirrored her emptiness. His endurance mirrored her denial. She began to understand that what bound them was not ownership, but reflection. He was her mirror, showing her what she had become and what she might have been if she had not buried her soul beneath privilege. The reason no one dared to bid was the same reason she now could barely look him in the eyes. He carried the truth that every oppressor fears, that the oppressed are not beneath them, but beyond them, spiritually undefeated. As the revelation deepened, the widow felt herself unraveling. She began to avoid the chapel, the mirrors, the sound of her own footsteps. Every object in the house seemed to accuse her. The wealth that once defined her now felt obscene, and the silence of the man she owned became the echo of her guilt. She realized that what she had bought was not a man but a truth disguised as one, a living testament to everything her world refused to see. His very existence demanded confession. No one had dared to bid because no one had wanted to face judgment. But she had, unknowingly, invited judgment to live under her roof. And now it walked through her halls with quiet steps, looking at her with eyes that did not condemn, only understood. The revelation was not about him at all. It was about her. It was about the sickness of a world that could not bear to look into the eyes of the humanity it had enslaved. It was about the horror of recognizing that freedom, once seen, can never be unseen. The truth she discovered did not destroy her suddenly. It dismantled her gently, as if peeling back the layers of a false identity. And though she wished to turn away, she could not. For once the mirror is lifted, the soul cannot go back to sleep. Redemption did not come to the widow as a gift. It arrived as a haunting. It began the night she could no longer bear her reflection. The house that had once been her sanctuary had become unbearable, every corridor echoing her footsteps like an accusation, every candle flicker reminding her of something she could no longer deny. The man she had purchased walked through her world like a quiet storm, his silence forcing her to see the wreckage of her own soul. There was no punishment greater than awareness. She began to realize that redemption is not found in the comfort of prayer or the illusion of forgiveness, but in the raw and painful confrontation with truth. Truth that strips away every mask, every justification, until only the naked soul remains. At first, she resisted this awakening. She tried to return to routine, to give orders, to reassert her authority, but each command that left her lips felt false. The words she once spoke with confidence now carried the weight of hypocrisy. The servants watched her with unease. They sensed the shift, but could not name it. Even the fields seemed to reject her, the crops struggling despite her efforts, the land reflecting the decay of her spirit. The man, however, continued his quiet work, untouched by her turmoil. His stillness became unbearable, not because it threatened her power, but because it revealed how hollow that power truly was. The longer she lived in his presence, the more she realized that redemption was not something one could demand or earn. It had to be endured. She began to dream of fire. In those dreams, the plantation burned, and she stood among the ashes with no fear, no tears, only understanding. The dreams frightened her at first, but soon she began to see them as visions, an invitation to release what had enslaved her spirit long before she had enslaved another. She awoke one night and wandered to the old chapel where she had first seen him standing in silence. There, in the moonlight, she knelt not to pray but to confess, though no one was there to hear her. She whispered to the shadows that she was tired, tired of pretending, tired of owning, tired of carrying a heart that knew the truth yet refused to live by it. She confessed not her sins, but her blindness. The silence that followed was not empty. It was mercy. The next morning she looked for him. When she found him working alone in the field, the air seemed heavier around him, as though the earth itself bent to his quiet strength. For the first time, she did not see him as property, nor as mystery, but as truth made flesh. She approached him slowly, the sun harsh on her pale skin, her breath shallow with the weight of what she was about to do. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words died in her throat. Instead, she did something no one on that plantation had ever seen. She knelt. The act was small in motion, but infinite in meaning. She, the mistress, bowed before the one she had enslaved. She could not name what she sought, forgiveness perhaps, or understanding. But in that single gesture, something in her spirit shifted. It was not submission to him, but to the truth he carried. He did not move to help her, nor did he turn away. His silence, as always, was complete. Yet within it, she felt acceptance, not of her as she was, but of her capacity to change. She realized that redemption is not about being absolved. It is about becoming whole. To be redeemed, she would have to dismantle every part of herself built upon falsehood. She would have to face the full weight of what she had done, not only to him, but to herself and to the countless others whose pain had paved her comfort. This confrontation would not end with a single act. It would be a lifelong reckoning. Yet in that field, beneath the unforgiving sun, she took her first breath of freedom. Days turned into weeks, and change began to show in subtle ways. She released the servants she no longer wished to command, sold parts of the land that had once been her pride, and refused to participate in the trade that had made her fortune. The community whispered that she had gone mad, that the slave had bewitched her, that grief had finally rotted her reason. But she no longer cared for their judgments. Her madness was awakening. Her ruin was her redemption. She began to live not as a mistress, but as a witness to the truth that had nearly destroyed her. Sometimes she still saw him at a distance, working, walking, always silent. They rarely spoke, yet a quiet understanding bound them. She no longer sought to own, nor to be absolved, only to live honestly in the shadow of what she had learned. The plantation, once full of false splendor, began to resemble something human, broken, humble, alive. The house no longer terrified her. The silence within it was no longer a curse. It had become peace. Redemption did not erase her past. It did not undo the harm or silence the memories. It simply allowed her to stand before them without denial. She understood now that true salvation is not freedom from guilt, but reconciliation with it, the willingness to look into the mirror of one's own darkness and not turn away. Through confrontation, she found clarity. Through clarity, she found humility. And through humility, she found the first fragile thread of grace. The man she had bought had given her nothing and taken nothing, yet through his silent truth, he had led her out of the blindness she called virtue. She would carry the weight of that revelation forever, not as punishment, but as proof that even in the ruins of sin, the soul can still rise, not pure, but whole.